this Pentecost Sunday, as we think about the Spirit, as we look at the color of red, the color of love, we recognize the diversity of the Spirit is such a theme of Pentecost. And as we give thanks for the diversity of creation, including diversity that we celebrate this month, we recognize that love is love and all given by you. And so for this month and for this day, we give thanks for the way the Spirit's moved throughout the history of this church. We give thanks for Pat, for Carol, for all who, Steve, Yoshi, everyone who's contributed to today, and for our time together. May the Spirit move, bring us closer together, and may we grow more in the diverse, loving image of your Son, in whose name we pray. Amen.
I'm
going to mute everybody. And Carol and Pat, you will have to unmute yourselves and get us started.
Thank you, Yoshi, for unmuting me. Well, first, I'm Pat Starr, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here today. Carol Starr and I have spent quite a lot of time exploring the history of our congregation, and for today's topic, more of our own faith community here at Bradley Hills, on the inclusion of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer members and hope for members. In preparation for this, we did interview Susan Andrews, who many of you on these screens will know and some will not remember, but Susan was our senior pastor for 17 years here at Bradley Hills, started I think in '87 if memory serves, and she will talk to us about the history as we have experienced it here at Bradley Hills at a time that many of you will recall, but if you don't, I think you will find it very interesting. She is concentrating primarily on our church, but you will see that it intersects a lot with the Presbyterian Church's approaches as well, because we are in and out of sometimes breaking the rules, sometimes defining the rules of the congregation. Following the videotape, we're going to hear from Susan Andrews. Carol Starr will talk with us a little bit more about some of the issues, and particularly a time frame of how we approach this issue, and again, where it intersected. But again, this will be a focus on our own congregation rather than on the Presbyterian Church. The reason I make that so clear is that that's a very complex and long discussion, and one I think that's worthy of our attention, but one which we do not have sufficient time to do today. Following Carol's explanation to us, we will then have a time for some discussion, questions and answers, whatever is appealing to all of you. So welcome, and I don't know who is controlling the tape of Susan Andrews. I will apologize in advance. Carol and I did this. The coloring is not good, but the words are magical and I think very helpful. So with that, here is Susan Andrews.
Peace to all of my friends at Bradley Hills Presbyterian Church. I continue to fondly remember my 17 years, the peak of my career as a pastor, and the joy it was to serve in Bethesda with the good folks at Bradley Hills. Carol and Pat have asked me to go back into memory and kind of walk through the process of Bradley Hills coming to terms with debating, dialoguing, and accepting the role of ordained homosexuals, lesbians, transgendered folks within the Presbyterian Church USA. So I will, to the best of my ability, tell the story of how I remember that issue while I was the pastor at Bradley Hills. Let me begin by saying that our denomination started struggling with this issue in 1978. And I was ordained in 1974. So it was something I had thought about and come to terms with and worked through theologically by the time that I was called to be the pastor of Bradley Hills Presbyterian Church in 1989. And yet it was not something that had surfaced in the denomination in any big way that we needed to deal with when I first came as pastor. It was, I think, in the early 90s that the denomination began to have overtures come to the General Assembly from various parts in the country, asking the denomination to change the Book of Order, to open up the offices of pastor, elder, and deacon to those who were homosexual and lesbian. This caused a great deal of turmoil for a good 15 years within the denomination at every single General Assembly. I became involved in that because I was a commissioner a couple of times. And then in 1997, a network of Presbyterians was formed, basically by two tall steeple pastors, John Buchanan from Chicago, Bob Bowl from Texas, asking the denomination to open its heart to the ordination of gays and lesbians. And they formed a coalition of pastors from around the country. And so I was asked to be part of that organization its very first year, as we tried to figure out how we could provide educational opportunities, resources, and most of all, a political strategy through presbyteries to try to get this change in the Book of Order. And so as a result of that, I came back to Bradley Hills after some of the initial meetings, and we met as a session, and we decided that as a congregation, the session decided that to sign on to and becoming a covenant network Presbyterian congregation, which meant we were also committing ourselves to doing education and outreach and consciousness raising about the issue. It was shortly after that, I believe, that the adult education ministry at Bradley Hills decided to do a 6-week series on homosexuality as a theological issue. Is homosexuality a biblical sin? Should the church open its offices to gays and lesbians? Would we as a congregation want to be openly welcoming to gay neighbors and visitors? Part of that educational process that I remember most clearly is, of course, with all of the NIH connections, we had a scientist from NIH who was a geneticist come in. And I remember that was the pivotal class, because this geneticist basically said, because the question is homosexuality a choice or is it a God-given gift? And this geneticist said that at that point, they couldn't conclusively find out that there was some sort of a genetic predisposition for people to become gay or lesbian in their sexual orientation. However, there was a hormonal connection. And then they proceeded to explain what that was. We also had a couple of openly gay Christians come in and talk about their faith. We had a biblical scholar come in to talk about what does the Bible say about homosexuality. And I think that was a very helpful 6-week series. Shortly thereafter, I'm getting my timing right, the church decided it was time, because we were growing, to call an associate pastor. Because quite frankly, I was overwhelmed with, even with Karen Werner as our educator, there was just too much for me to do. So the process went on. The search committee came up with Scott Winnett, fell in love with him, a graduate of Louisville Presbyterian Seminary, somebody who'd had another career before he went to seminary, charming, funny, smart, likable, very relational. So Scott was presented to the congregation voted him in as their associate pastor. He was then both ordained and installed in our Bradley Hills sanctuary. About a month later, Scott came to me and said, "Susan, I need to tell you something." He said, "I've been wrestling with this for years, but I have come to the conclusion in my heart and in my body that I am gay, and that I need to be able to integrate this identity with my ministry. And I really don't want to keep this quiet." So I kind of gulped and I said, "Well, Scott, I think this is an important conversation. Let's you and I go and talk with Terry Thomas, the general presbyter of Hudson River Presbytery, so we can think through strategy and how to move forward." So that's what we did. Terry was wonderful, but she and I both said to Scott, "Scott, given the fact that the Presbyterian Church at this point does not acknowledge or allow gay pastors. You are putting your career on the line in terms of this decision. So Terry said, Scott, I would like to, out of Presbyterian funds, find you a counselor who deals with people who are coming to terms with their sexual orientation. And then we'll pay for a year and then we'll revisit this conversation. So that's what happened. A year later, I watched Scott blossom as a pastor, become more confident. And then he came to me a year later and he said, Susan, it's time. I know this is who I am. I can no longer be in the closet. And I said, okay. So the first thing I did was gather together a group of former clerks of session, including the current clerk of session, plus a couple of people from the personnel committee. I asked Scott to write a letter describing exactly his process, his heart, his understanding of himself as a human being, as a pastor, as a man, as a gay man. So we met one Sunday night, I'll never forget it, in the library. There were 12 people around the table. Scott came in and I said, Scott has something he would like to share with you. At which point Scott read his letter, the most beautiful letter I could have imagined, beginning with, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. And then he talked about how he knew from it as a child that Jesus loved him. And then he went on with his letter.
Like that.
When he was done, I did not say a word. I just let it be silent.
There's a data broker
and I will probably cry when I tell you this. The first person to speak was Ginger Vanderver, who at that point was the clerk of session. I was nervous about how Ginger would respond to this, quite frankly. And she said, she looked straight at Scott and she said, Scott, I have 4 sons. And if any of my 4 sons ever came to me to share what you have just shared with us, I would have only one response, and that is unconditional love and acceptance. It broke the silence and people began to talk. People began to talk about their family members, their co-workers, their teachers, people they knew who were gay. And the end result of that meeting, although it was not an official body, was that this was something that Bradley Hills should embrace and celebrate. So then we went through the process of the session meeting. The session meeting was long and involved, lots of questions. Nobody was nasty about it, but there was a concern about the youth of the church and what this would do in terms of youth being influenced by a gay youth pastor. But the session voted to reaffirm Scott's call as an associate pastor. And so then the next step, I said I would meet with the senior highs. I met with the senior highs, and of course they never met with me, so they knew this was something fishy. So about 12 of them sat down around a table, and they said to me, we know why you're coming to talk to us. I said, oh, you do? He said, yeah, you're going to tell us Scott's gay. Of course he's gay. We've known he was gay from the first day he walked in the door, and we love him. So that wasn't a concern. But there was a concern in terms of sending this letter out to the whole congregation, which was the next step. And that is that Scott had not told his family. So I said to Scott, Scott, you are not going to tell 600 people about your sexual orientation before you go home and tell your mom, your dad, and your siblings. So we got him an airplane ticket, gave him a week off. He flew out to Tennessee. That's the night I put his letter in the mailbox to the entire congregation. He came back a week later. He couldn't even get into his office because there were so many balloons and notes and pots of soup and loaves of bread and notes and flowers telling Scott that he was dearly, dearly loved. So we lost two families, and that was it. So that's what I remember as the process that happened at Bradley Hills. Fast forward to 2003, I stood for moderator of the General Assembly with the loving support of Bradley Hills and the encouragement of Bradley Hills, which I will forever be grateful for. No moderatorial candidate in the history of the General Assembly had come out in favor of the ordination of gays and lesbians. I stood on that stage. I was one of 3 candidates, and I did indeed, because I knew it was the first question that was asked. And so I said, I have studied this and prayed about this biblically and theologically, and I am 100% convinced that being gay or lesbian is part of the design of God's creation, that it is not a sin, and that our church should be completely open to the ordination of ministers of word and sacrament, elders, and deacons. However, at that point, the General Assembly was in the middle of a study. And I said, I didn't think the General Assembly should vote on ordination until that study was done. As a result of that, I had a wonderful year as moderator, traveled all over the country and the world. But as a result of that, no Southern churches except for one asked me to be with them, because the Southern part of our denomination was almost categorically opposed to this study and dialogue about whether or not we should open ordination to gays and lesbians. I can say that when I left in 2006, feeling that my 17 years, it broke my heart, but I knew that I had done what I had been called to do, that the church needed a younger pastor with small children, and that it was time for me to move on into a new chapter of my ministry. So I was called in 2006 to be the general presbyter of Hudson River Presbytery, 90 churches north of New York City. There was a little bit of a wrinkle at the beginning of that in terms of my stance on the homosexuality issue. I was interviewed by a local paper, quoted as being in favor of the ordination of gays and lesbians. 3 of the conservative churches in that presbytery tried to block my election on the floor of that presbytery. But because we knew it was coming, I met with them ahead of time. We had a wonderful conversation. I said that I was not going to in any way punish or force this issue on anyone at any point. And so we were able to move through that. Since then, after that, I sort of retired in 2015. I've done some interims and some part-time educational roles in churches here in St. Louis. And all of them have been progressive and open to this issue and to my stance on it. 2 things more I want to say. The other thing that happened the year that I was moderator, my last day as moderator, as I was coming off the platform to go to the bathroom, a man named Ralph Paul Jensen, who was an elder from California, came up to me and served me papers, which means that he was bringing charges against me for knowingly and openly ordaining a homosexual pastor. Scott got the exact same summons in another way. So both of us had been brought up on charges. Long and short of it is the presbytery could not have been more supportive. Cindy Bolbach, who then ended up being a moderator, but she was my attorney and she was Scott's attorney when we went before the Permanent Judicial Commission of National Capital Presbytery. And quite frankly, without going into all the details, the charges for both Scott and for me were set aside. So, but it was a very emotional process to have to go through that and to have my whole ordination and my whole ministry on the line for something that I felt strongly about was the will, the grace, and the love of God. And there were many people in the denomination that went through that. So let me say that Bradley Hills could not have been more open, supportive, thoughtful. This was not something that was rushed through. This is not something that we just checked a box. We did dialogue, we did debate. I talked to many people individually. And I think not everybody was comfortable with the decision to become a Covenant Network church and to continue to support Scott Winnett as our associate pastor. But the key was that people had gotten to know and love Scott. And you can't know and love Scott without accepting all of who he is. The other postscript to this is that many of you will remember Matt Rupsich, who was the wonderful children's music director for many years at Bradley Hills. And at its peak, he had 87 children. in the Wednesday afternoon program that he and Karen Warner did together in the choirs and in various Bible activities. You may recall that a disgruntled father brought charges against Matt through the local police for inappropriately acting with a child because he was gay. That's another whole story that somebody can tell you. We went through hell and back. We hired an attorney. We spent $10,000. We let put Matt on administrative leave, let every parent of a child know what was going on. Nobody could believe it. Nobody. But we had a big meeting in the sanctuary where the police were going to give their report and where I was going to give the report of kind of consequences and what would happen. We got to that meeting. The police officer stood up and said, nobody knows this, not even Susan, but we are completely setting aside these charges. And we have learned that this was a homophobic attack against Matt Rupsich, his reputation, and his person. And therefore, this entire legal action is finished. At which point, Matt entered the sanctuary to a standing ovation with tears streaming down people's faces because Matt was so beloved. So Bradley Hills has gone through some things around this issue and has come out on the other side as a loving, caring, progressive, thoughtful congregation who doesn't do things quickly, but certainly works through things with grace and with intelligence. When I left in 2006, my biggest fear, because Scott was still there, that ordination the denomination had yet to approve ordination, though it did eventually. Scott would be in jeopardy if he left the church because he would have a hard time finding another call. So my biggest fear was that my successor as pastor of Bradley Hills would not be supportive of Scott or who he was as a person. And I have been absolutely thrilled in many ways with David's leadership, but certainly in those early years to know how much he supported and cared for Scott. Set my heart at ease and made me smile once more at the wisdom of Bradley Hills for who you call as your leaders. One final word, and that is, some of you may not know this, but Matt Rupsich and Patrick Field had been partners for years and years. And in 2014, when gay marriage became legal, they asked me to perform their wedding. And so Matt and Patrick were married in Baltimore at Peabody with Donald at the organ in 2015. And it was an absolutely glorious day with much of the love of Bradley Hills surrounding them. So that's what I have to say, friends. Keep on going, keep on loving, be graceful, prophetic, progressive, be who you are as the people of God, a really special congregation. Blessings.
Hi, Susan. Could you clarify what the position of the Presbyterian Church was at the time of the establishment of the Covenant Network and also of Scott's situation?
In 1996, at that General Assembly, because this issue had become such a hot potato, an overture was passed, an overture meaning something that changes our book of order, which is what controls or shapes our life as a denomination, particularly around issues of ordination. And Amendment B is what it was called, was added to the book of order because a majority of presbyteries approved it. And what that said was that those who are elected and installed in the offices of the church, elders, deacons, ministers of word and sacrament, that they must, in terms of sexual activity and identity, they must exercise fidelity in the covenant of marriage between a man and a woman, or fidelity in singleness. So it was a clear definition, and it was meant to stop this whole movement toward the ordination of gays and lesbians. But what it did, which is what our session talked about, was it also said that if you're an ordained elder or an ordained deacon, and you happen to have a girlfriend or you're living with somebody and you're not married, that you also cannot enter into any kind of sexual activity, which in 1995 across this country was like living in la la land. So part of the backlash of all of this was that it not only affected ministers of word and sacrament, but also elders and deacons. And I think that year we had installed an officer at Bradley Hills, I don't remember who was an adult, heterosexual, living with a partner. And people didn't bat an eye. So this is how complicated it was and how kind of reactive it was. Then we went through several years more of debate, peace, unity, and purity task force, overtures to the next few general assemblies. And then I believe it was in 2010 when finally a conclusive decision was made. And the decision was that because we could not agree as a denomination on this issue, that it was a non-essential of the faith. It wasn't the Trinity, it wasn't Jesus as Lord, it wasn't the Bible, it's an important issue, but a non-essential of the faith, and that our polity allowed for freedom of conscience and mutual forbearance. So the decision of the assembly was that it would be up to every local presbytery to decide whether or not to ordain a gay or lesbian pastor, and it would be up to every local session to decide whether or not they would ordain a gay or lesbian deacon or elder. In other words, it was local option. That is what the compromise was, and that is what was eventually put into the Book of Order, taking out this other exclusive language. There were people in many of the gay and lesbian people and many of the more progressive people in the denomination were not happy with this compromise because they said it continued to allow for discrimination and homophobia. But on the other hand, it allowed for people to continue to be church together, even though they had deep-seated personal, biblical, and theological disagreements on this issue. So that is where the church took a stand in 2010, and that's where it stands now.
Susan, can I ask another question? Actually, it's really more of a comment about something you said earlier. You were talking about some concerns about Scott's influence on the children in the church and to some degree Matt's as well. And I just wanted to share the other side of that. As I think you're well aware, my daughter Meg, who's in a long-term, she's married now with children to another woman. And she came to this realization when she was in high school. And I recall first coming to you and ready to share this. I said I had something important to talk with you about. And I have to laugh now when I think, because I remember you said, I already know what you're going to say to me, Pat. And of course you were right, because you had seen, you knew Meg, but you also, so this one pastor was very supportive, but I want to emphasize the role of Scott to this young woman, because I think for any of our youth or adults, obviously as well, who are gay or lesbian, I think this was a spiritual leader with whom they could have a special bond and who could minister to them in a special way. And I felt that that was a true gift to Meg to have that. She was also blessed by her school and other things to come to a very happy, I mean, she's one of the happiest people I know, well-adjusted. She does everything you'd hope a kid would do. But I attribute much of that to the acceptance, particularly of you and of Scott, to some degree to the church, but she wasn't really out to the church quite then, although at school she was, so I'm not sure it was very secret. But nonetheless, do you have any thoughts on that, or did you observe that at others?
Well, it starts with the fact that she had incredibly supportive and loving parents.
Yes,
who completely and unconditionally embraced and accepted who she was. But you know, I can, and I'm sorry if I reacted that way to you when you came to me.
I thought it was great. Oh, I love the reaction.
I need to let you know that Scott and I had talked about it, because
Oh,
Scott
okay.
was pretty aware. You know,
Yeah.
gaydar is not
Yeah.
hard to have. And
Yeah.
he and I had talked about how important it was for him, and he wanted to be
Yeah.
as supportive of her and affirming of her as he could be. So,
Yes.
but yes, and you don't know how many others in the church who may have had a gay child, or
Yeah.
who may have, you know, come to terms with this issue in their own lives in ways that never became public. And as far as I know, though there are gay members at Bradley Hills, this is not part of the basic identity of the church. It's part of a church that is open to the diversity of God's people, whether it be gender or race or, you know, the whole
Right.
relationship with the Jewish congregation. This is just a church that is open to the beauty and diversity of God's people.
Amen. Well, thank you so much for that good statement, and I agree with it completely.
Carol,
Yes,
you
okay,
want you want to fire up your,
yes, hold on just one moment. Okay,
I don't think I've heard a more powerful presentation in 2+ years that I've been on this lay ministry.
well, I want to thank you, and I wanted to, what I'm going to do right now is to just provide us with some timeline so that you kind of see this. Look at, focus on one particular development that the church went through that's important, and then look at there are some subsequent actions that we've taken. I want to particularly thank Susie Wellman, who has served as clerk of session. She spent some hours researching this with us so that we could have these dates and share this with you. She's been very important as far as this is concerned. So what we would look at and Susan, it's hard to express how well Susan put this together for us. Just to confirm some of what okay, so wait a minute. Okay, just to confirm some of what Susan shared. Okay, I'm sorry, we're going back and forth. I would also like to say that we have 2 papers that will be available to folks. One that sort of goes through the timeline for the national church and how it got where it is today, as well as a separate one for Bradley Hills. But just to confirm what we've heard from Susan, as far as the timeline of events is concerned, you can look at this early on. We went through the situation with Matt Rubsich, where the church actually did support him, but the parent filed a complaint. We went through the police process, and he was exonerated, and the church supported him. Soon after that, in '97, Bradley Hills joined the Covenant Network and donated to it. Susan was active and a leader with this. Then it was in '97 that Scott joined us as associate pastor. He went through this entire process, supported by Susan, the presbytery, and eventually the session, so that in April 2000, he sent out this letter. Then it was in 2002 that Susan was elected, or she was elected moderator with the support of Bradley Hills, knowing her position as far as this issue was concerned. And as she explained, it was after she finished her term, 2004, that this complaint was filed against her. The session not only supported her, but they actually sent a letter to the church, home church of Paul Roth Jensen, asking them to discipline him for the distress that his complaint had caused. Then in May 2004, the session recommended that a task force begin work to recommend how we as a church could become more welcoming to gays and lesbians. This was called the Welcoming Task Force. Ed Hummers chaired that task force. The task force deliberated for over a year. It wasn't until July 2005 that its recommendations were actually accepted and approved by the session. There were two open mic sessions where everyone in the church was involved and invited to come to ask questions, to express fears, concerns, which were definitely expressed during those open mic sessions. And so that it wasn't until really July 2005 that the recommendations from the task force were approved by the session. And these recommendations are the following: that we added inclusive language to our website, bulletin, and newsletter. And this is the language that was approved, particularly that term sexual orientation. People argued against that. And there were, at the time, the session was much larger than it is today. There were 6 votes against including this particular recommendation, but the session was like, there were 23 people on the session, so it was approved. That we also submitted an overture to the General Assembly to remove that Amendment B that Susan explained, to remove that from the Book of Order. The recommendation also was included to encourage regular education and dialogue, particularly welcoming for the youth connection, that we reaffirm our responsibility continually to our children and youth, and authorize commitment ceremonies for homosexual partners, that we continually revisit, monitor, and confirm what we're doing. And then also subsequently, for at least 7 years, we held annual AIDS benefit concerts and donated substantial funds to organizations such as the Dennis Avenue Health Center that supported the struggle that we were facing with homophobia and victims of AIDS. We applied and received a Presbyterian grant in 2019 to partner and support Gen Out, DC's only vocal ensemble, and Gen Out will be performing at Bradley Hills on June 19th. Efforts have been made to make sure that staff members and youth, LGBTQ, are welcome into the life of the church, and that we have tried to be very open about our history when interviewing new members, staff, and consequently, this particular program is part of those efforts. So at this point, I think we could open this to questions, discussions, clarification, anything that people need. Steve?
How do you want to handle this, Carol and Pat? Do you want to call on people, or do you want me to monitor? I don't have any questions in the chat yet, but let me start with one at least. That
okay.
You have more history on this than I do. Did anything ever become of the charges that were brought against Susan and Scott? Or were they simply dismissed?
They were dismissed.
They were dismissed. But it still caused great pain, I think, to both of them, perhaps more to Scott even than to Susan, because it was a very personal attack. But yes, they were not, there was no follow-up with any investigation or anything. Correct.
Right. Do others have questions?
Carol, do we know how many Presbyterian churches actually have gay pastors?
You know, I'm not aware of that number right now. I don't know. I do know that when Matt Nabinger was applying for his position as an educator, that he was very honest that there were probably very few churches that he could comfortably apply to, even to be a church educator. But I don't know what the number is right now.
And we should, of course, remember that Scott has had a very successful tenure as the head of, as a pastor, senior pastor for a major congregation in our area, and with, I think, almost totally positive results. So that's another single example. An N of one doesn't answer your question, but at least we do have good examples, John.
Although I do think there were limitations for him within the Presbyterian Church.
No, and I even think for Susan, that's true. I asked Susan this question off camera, but I said, was her job search following her service as moderator hampered by this? And she said, well, I don't think so much, Pat, but I actually observed myself that it was in talking with her when she looked at places to serve. She happily had many options, but nonetheless, it limited her as well. So I don't think we have rose-colored glasses on that all was just happy and rosy. At the end, no, it remains an issue in our congregation. I see Stay has his hand up.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, Brigitte has a hand up, and then Karen.
And Michael Gibson also.
Hi, can I speak for Stahis now? Can I go ahead?
Brigitte is up first.
Brigitte's hand was up first, so.
Okay. Hi, Susan, it is so nice to see you again. But I just wanted to tell you a little story. I don't think Dave and I would be at Bradley Hills as members nowadays if I was on session at Capitol Hill Presbyterian Church and had to attend or was privileged to attend a Presbyterian meeting. And we were supposed to go into small groups, and I was seated next to Scott, Susan, and Karen Werner. So I was kind of paired with them, and Susan probably doesn't remember. She was, we then had to go like talk to each other, and I was paired with Susan. And at that point, I didn't know who anybody was or what Bradley Hills was. And I was just so delighted. And at that meeting, I think this whole amendment, Bradley Hills brought that initiative to get rid of this amendment B, or, you know, Susan, you would know all the details, but it was at that Presbyterian meeting. And that really made me look into more closely into Bradley Hills and then attend. And the first worship service I attended was when Susan was giving a sermon on the quilt, and that was at the National Mall, and her brother, and the choir sang, and I thought, well, this is going to be a place. It took us a number more years to, you know, because we don't do things easily because we were so entrenched at Capitol Hill Presbyterian Church, but eventually, you know, we kind of migrated to Bradley Hills. So anyway, long story, but thank you, Susan.
We are so glad you did, my friend.
Okay, Joy and Stahis, and then Karen.
Right, Stahis' question.
And Michael Gibson after that.
Okay.
Okay. He says, dear Susan, it's wonderful seeing and hearing you. The question is this: homosexuality remains a major divisive and conflict issue among Christians, fundamentalists, Catholics, Orthodox, and more. How can the Presbyterian Church experience be offered to assist others to overcome their homophobia?
I want someone else to answer that one. Susan is not with us today, so she cannot answer this. But perhaps what I think Susan would say that we need to have more dialogue and we need to listen to each other more. I think that it's hard for us in this society right now to have very different points of view on this and actually engage in any kind of conversation. One of the things that I think was key to what we were able to do here at Bradley Hills is we did engage in those painful conversations. People cannot seem to do that now, particularly on a national level. So I think that it's hard to answer your question because these are genuine and honest and heartfelt differences of opinion. But we obviously are pretty steadfast in ours. And the science, I think, supports our position, but nonetheless, I can't answer for Susan, but I would think that her answer probably would be that we need to find ways to have those conversations. Carol, do you have any other insights from our conversation with Susan on that?
No, I thank you, Pat. You're quite articulate. I'd like to, yeah, thank you. Give others the.
I also just wanted to include that I think if those kinds of discussions are happening, it's important that LGBTQ members in the churches have a voice in that, because I think so often these conversations are had about us, but don't include us. So I just think it's super important that our voices are lifted up in these conversations so that people can see our own personal perspectives within the church as queer people.
But Leanne, may I add, Leanne, that it's been a joy to watch you grow up in this congregation and to find out the person you are. And we celebrate you and we celebrate the light you're living and your commitment to your Christian faith through all these parts of your life. So thank you. I've been on Facebook with you and I'm so pleased with the information you have recently shared. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm engaged, which is what she's talking about.
But yes.
Thank you.
But you're right. You're right. I agree with you. We don't always do that as much as we can. So, yeah, thanks.
One of the dimensions that I think Bradley Hills does pretty well at this is to model supportive and inclusive behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
We put our money where our mouth is. For years we were doing AIDS benefit concerts. We're now actively supporting the Gen Out chorus. We have gay staff members. We welcome gay members of the congregation. We put them into positions of leadership in the church, and so we're modeling what it should look like as good Christians.
Maybe not always. I know Michael Gibson had wanted to say something. Could we recognize him?
I didn't see that one.
Sure. Just real quick, I know Karen Harrison had a question. I didn't want to preempt her. I just want to make a note for everybody. The part 2 of this presentation will occur on June 26. We've seen sort of the trees, if you will, talking about Bradley Hills and the PCUSA. We're going to have a presentation by Lynette Ross, who is going to talk about Christendom as a whole and also about the future of these issues they face for the entire church, raising a lot of I think hopefully we'll address some of the questions that Stais had, and she's a friend of mine. She's also a pastor in Houston as part of the Bearing Church, which recently broke off from the Methodist Church over to join the United Church of Christ over the narrowness, if you will, of the Methodist Church's approach to this. So that's all I wanted to say. Just put a plug in for June 26, and I think it's Karen's turn, and I'm sorry I cut in front of you, Karen.
What do you want to do? Thank you.
Yeah.
My question was, does this mean that in our denomination, individual congregations are allowed to not ordain LGBTQ plus people? I mean, this is difficult for me. Of my 3 children, two are queer, and none of them will come to church. They don't even come at Christmas anymore, and they're angry. And I said, no, we're fine, but maybe we're not.
Maybe I should answer because I have faced the same issue, Karen, that you face, and then perhaps Carol can put it in a larger perspective, because I do think that our own particular church has been very supportive of my own daughter, who, like your two children, is gay. One of the things I used to laugh about when Meg went off to college at the University of Colorado is shortly after she'd get home at holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, she'd say, I think I'm just going to pop over to the church and see who's there. And I thought, how many college kids within 20 minutes of getting home want to go to their church? So it's clear that in her case, she did not see this, but she used to say at Colorado, because there are many very conservative organizations headquartered there, and she used to say to me when they would come to campus, Mom, these people just give Christians a bad name. And I think that's what your children are hearing. There are Christians who give Christians a bad name, and I fear that that is what they are responding to. So I think it's our responsibility, Karen, to say, there are Christians who give Christians a bad name, but there are churches that will welcome you and will honor you. And I hate to say you have to cherry pick, but in a sense, you really have to look for those churches which do that. But I have faced exactly what you're talking about. And I love my daughter's response, because I do think that as Christians, that is part of who we are, is to love and accept other people, regardless of our own orientation. But do you have more of a scholarly response to that, Carol?
No, I wish I did, but no, I mean, Karen, there are churches that, because this is local option, so to speak, there are churches that do not accept the ordination, the commitment. Yeah.
One other item I would add to this, Karen, is after you're in PCUSA right now, most of the churches do participate fully in the ordination of gays and lesbians. Unfortunately, that's partly because 700 churches actually left the denomination at this point. So there are people who were formerly part of our denomination who are no longer part of it because they did not agree with this. But what that has left us with is churches primarily within our denomination. Again, that's not Christians as a whole, but within our denomination, who are really supportive. So that was a sort of a self-selection that we saw. So that's the other thing. But again, your question is broader than that, and it's a very legitimate question, one which I think many of us are even more worried about now with the stance of the Supreme Court and some of the very conservative politicians that our children or our nephews or nieces or brothers or sisters will suffer at the hands of people who have no right to make such judgments about them. So I do believe that this time is a particularly difficult time, and unfortunately, I use the term conservative. There are many good conservative values, but I'll use the term conservative Christians. Reading of the scriptures simply is not consistent with where I had thought our society was going, but where I fear it may be backpedaling on now.
Also, I'd like to add that people are still talking about gay and lesbian, believing, I guess, that people are one or the other. I have a child who's non-binary, and this kid needs to be included too.
Oh, and that's why I thought I was careful to say LGBTQ when I started this, because it is
you need the plus.
Yeah, exactly, the plus, being the plus. But I do think that, because you're right, we value people for who they are, and there may be more pluses to come. And whatever the plus is, I think non-binary is I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that follows the same acceptance that we feel for our other brothers and sisters.
Going off that, do we know what the agreement at the national level, what the language is? Because it sounds like we keep hearing lesbian and gay, but that's, as Karen was saying, is exclusionary, bisexual, transgender, anybody. I mean, it's a huge umbrella and spectrum. So is the terminology at the level of the agreement just lesbian and gay?
I believe it's LGBTQ plus. I believe it is. We will need to check that, but it's my understanding that that is the case. However, that doesn't really answer Karen's question quite either, because hers is a broader question. But I do believe in our own denomination that these other issues, binary, are issues which are included. Carol can perhaps clarify that more.
My understanding is this is the language. The PCUSA has no consensus in the interpretation of scripture on issues of same-sex practice. And then that makes reference to our longstanding Presbyterian commitment to freedom of conscience and mutual forbearance. So it doesn't.
Clarify, Carol, that was written some time ago. I think our understanding in very recent years has become more broadened. And so I think when this was written, we were really looking at an either or kind of thing. And I think, as Karen so well points out, that there are many other people with sexual identities which are beyond that, black and white that we start. But at the time we wrote this, I don't think we were as sensitive, at least, to that. So that's my hearing, but I don't know. Again, I would like to find out more. Yeah.
I can send you, Karen. In 2019, there were 3 grievance or apologies made by the church. But I don't think this particular language is even included in that. I'll send you that. Okay. Yeah.
I wonder if there is a presbytery level statement on this. Since it's presbytery option, I wonder if National Capital Presbytery has issued its own statement on what the presbytery's view is.
Well, let us find that out. Carol and I can take this on as our assignment, since we will have topics related to this for the next few weeks. I would suggest that Carol and I do our homework and come back to you so you'll know what we have. And then if we believe that some additional work is necessary, we have submitted overtures before and we can do it again. So we will, Carol and I will take this on as a role.
Let me suggest to everyone who's interested in these issues also that a very good forum to follow these issues in the various branches of Christianity is the newsletter of the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI.org. We've had their executive director, Robbie Jones, on to speak about a couple of his books. And what I'm seeing in those newsletters is that the conservative and the evangelical Christians are becoming harder and harder over on this issue, but at the price of losing significant millions of followers. Yeah. So that it's a loud voice, but an ever smaller voice on this. John Gaffney, you got your hand up. Unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. I can give. Let me remark a little bit about what the Rule of Orders says. I believe it's up to a local church whether the pastor is allowed to perform same-sex marriages. That's written in there. And let me give you a little bit of background about the Presbytery. When the Presbytery finally agreed to support the overture to change our Rule of Order, Book of Order, I'm sorry, there was a lot of, and I was and still am a commissioner to the Presbytery. Anyway, there was a lot of discussion and there were debates, and then there were, shall we say, some of the debates were theologically oriented, and I won't say what pastors were against allowing or permitting gay pastors and gay marriage, but it was interesting to come out on both sides of the biblical view on this. My view, which I had expressed publicly, was it's love that prevails, and that's what we're taught to love all people, and that's my guiding light here. Anyway, and that's why I was fervently supportive of that change to our rule of order, book of order. I can't speak English today. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Steve, do you want to, Susan Andrews has clarified for in the chat. She actually has been watching this. I'm not sure if she's still with us, but she says.
She is indeed still with us.
Yeah, the language at the national level is currently LGBTQ. Yes. And advocacy groups like More Light and Covenant Network are focusing on transgender and non-binary identities right now. We do have a presentation next week on transgender issues. So I would highly invite you to that as well.
Next week, thank you for that, Carol. You led right into what one of the things that I wanted to say before we break up. Next week, we'll have the Reverend Paige Bach from Providence Presbyterian Church on making the flock complete, ministering to transgender youth. So that's going to be a very interesting and probably pretty tough conversation. And then, as Michael said, at the end of the month, we'll have a presentation on a church that had a very different experience than ours, and it's important to hear those experiences as well. On the 19th, to celebrate Juneteenth for the first time, we will have Brandon Waddle, whom many of you will remember from his leadership of our choir back in March with Matthew. He'll be talking about Negro spirituals as freedom music. And that promises to be a really interesting talk. But next week, it's making the flock complete, ministering to transgender youth.
Could I just add in, just because we briefly talked about language, one of the things that struck me, and I know that language is constantly changing and it's hard to keep up, but a word that I think my community has strayed away from in more recent years is the word homosexual. And I know that tends to be what a lot of older generations still use to categorize us. But I think because the word is sort of steeped in this history of even like pathologizing, like it was once a pathological condition to be homosexual. It's talked about as a sin. It's talked about, I mean, even legal terms, it was always used as homosexual. And so I think that's a word we have sort of pushed away from. And that's not to say it won't be reclaimed, just as you may have heard like me and Karen using the word queer. That is a word that we have reclaimed. It used to be used as a slur. I personally identify as queer. I don't identify as lesbian or other terms. I like the term queer personally. And a lot of us like that as an umbrella term for our community because it can encapsulate lesbians, gays, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, anybody falls under that queer blanket. I know some people might not feel comfortable using that term. You can always use LGBT+, LGBTQ+, any of those phrases if that feels more comfortable to you. But in general, I think we tend to, I don't know, I wince a little when I hear the word homosexual.
And I would add to that, I think first you brought up a really important point. Some of what you're saying I think is generational, but much of it is simply how we use our language. And I've seen several comments in the chat about this and how we use the language that to describe people. And we happen to be talking in one area today, but we could be talking about a totally different subject and we'd still face some of those same issues. Of the language we choose to use sometimes colors people's opinion based on their upbringing, based on their generation, based on their ethnicity, based on whatever. So I do think it's an important issue that's sort of a side issue here but I believe you have pointed, Leanne, I think you've done a great service of pointing out that self-identification and how we identify others, and those are two separate but important issues that we need to at least have sensitivity to this, and then be more aware of what the baggage is that goes along with some of these, that maybe we need to find better words or go back to reclaim old words that were, well, even the word gay, I sing these old songs about, I'm a singer and I sing these old songs about when we were young and gay, and I'm always thinking, well, not gay that way, but gay that way. And that, so I do understand that. I think it may be a subject for another adult ed at some point. It sounds like an interesting topic. Thank you.
Jen Anderson's comment that we should consider having a session just on the terminology. I like that suggestion. We'll take it under advisement with the adult ed lay ministry. Leanne, do not be surprised if I reach out to you to get some ideas on how we could approach that.
No problem.
That's a really interesting and really important topic.
I do think that next week's session will include at least, will address this to some extent anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, there have been efforts to eradicate the word gay, meaning happy, from the language by doing such things as global word replacements in text, so that you end up with a rock and roll singer named Marvin Homosexual.
I think he had an E at the end of that, though.
Did Nancy Silky have a question at some point? I don't know if we answered her question. I think she had her hand.
I do have I'll try to be brief, an experience that I want to share with you. We moved to South Florida in 2016, and I have gone to the big Presbyterian Church in South Florida that is a member of PCUSA. And in the first year I was at the church, one of the retired ministers from Chicago who was there said to me, "Oh, you're from Bradley Hills. I know about Susan Andrews, and I know about what all you have been doing there." He said, "I want you to know what this church decided to do." So this is in the period of 2010, about half the churches left the Presbytery of tropical Florida over the issue of gay, at that time, I'm going to say gay and lesbians because 2010, that was the word that was being used. They just left the Presbyterian Church, took all their property with them, which was highly unusual, but it was done. And so I said, well, what has this church decided to do? Well, this church has decided, in a big church in a fairly liberal town, decided that they would just not discuss the issue further. They would just leave it as it was, and because they didn't want to tear the church apart, and that particular church apart. And so that was where it's, I was just sort of, he said to me, "You will be aghast." And I said I was. And so that's where this church is about the issue, as far as I can tell. But what has happened, there are gay members of the church, married men who are members of the church. One of those men was ordained as a deacon. So all of this is happening, but without any discussion about it. So it just sort of leaves you it left me in a very odd, so they're doing, I just don't know where the church, what to do, where you go with this. But I just wanted to throw this out there rather than addressing the issue. The issue is just, it's just there. We'll just proceed. And maybe this is how you have to proceed in a very conservative place until you have enough people who say, oh, start accepting what is happening in the world. I don't know, but I just wanted to throw that out to you. And I'll just leave it there.
Don't ask, don't tell didn't work very well for the military.
Yeah, well.
Yeah. Good point.
Well, maybe as long as we have just a moment, I want to share a story about my own daughter, who many of you know, who went to a school here called Holton Arms. Some of you will know the school, some of you won't. But she had the experience. When you talked about it, Nancy, I thought when she talked to her counselor and she realized when she was, I guess, a sophomore, that she was actually, and I will use the term, forgive me, Leanne, I'm going to use the term lesbian at the time. But
You can still use lesbian if she identifies.
I know. And I'm not sure, I'm going to ask her about that when we talk today, by the way, and see how she, but anyway, I thought that they might do something that, you know, they would sort of pat you on and say, sweetie, that's just fine. Let's just not talk about it. I was so pleased that this school not only chose not to do that, but they chose to embrace Meg where she was. They suggested she talk to some teachers who were lesbian, that she talked to I think she just went once to a psychiatrist they recommended, and they embraced her in this new finding about herself. I'm going to fast forward 2 years later when there was a vote that was announced at this beautiful graduation where all the ladies were in their white dresses for graduation. The student who was selected by all of the upper school students at Holton Arms as the leader who best exemplified Holton Arms values was Meg Stalker. Now, I say that not to say that she had some great success, but that the school actually claims some of that success because they chose, and this is something I can't see happening at the church you're in now. Maybe it could in 10 years, but to embrace people where they are. And I will forever be grateful to the school, who it would have been easy to just say, sweetie, let's just not talk about it. And that would have been an understandable, but in my opinion, wrong response. So when you told your story, I want to share this story about how one can actually embrace. And Meg has, as many of you know, has gone on to a wonderful life, and she has she embraces who she is. So maybe, Steve, I've taken way too much time on this, so I will back off. Thank you.
Not at all. This has been technically the hardest presentation to assemble that we have done in 2.5 years. So I want to extend special thanks to Pat Stocker, to Carol Starr, to Susan Andrews, to the indefatigable Yoshi Say, and to everybody who has participated here. This is such an important part of our church history that the first thing I'm going to do when the office reopens on Tuesday is to discuss with the staff how we can save this as a permanent record of our church history. Usually we save adult education sessions for about 6 months. This one needs to be saved long, long term. We will see you all next Sunday morning, same time, same Zoom. And Leanne, I hope that you'll be with us next week to continue to advocate on the language issues, among other things.
Next weekend is Pride weekend, so we'll see.
Yes, I chance to do it, Leanne.
I might be off gallivanting in DC.
Well, it's wonderful to have you, Leanne. We all
but thank you so much, Leanne. And do bring some more people of your generation to future sessions on whatever topic.
And congratulations on your engagement. That's
Thank you
Yes.
so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, my fiance wanted to be a part of this, but she's packing for a work trip. So in the future.
Okay, thank you all. We'll see you next Sunday.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.